Why the notion of a just transition is so important is because when we're talking about transitioning, we forget that a lot of people don't even have sufficient energy. So when we talk about the developing world and my continent, Africa, we're talking the just transition to them is getting enough energy to survive, getting enough energy to live a dignified life. We're starting at a scenario where per capita, the average African with the installed capacity has barely 404 kilowatt hours in sub-Saharan Africa. That is kind of 20 times less than the average American. So the just is really important. For the first time in history, we actually truly have the chance for when people are getting energy, it to be clean, it to be renewables. But you can't forget the fact that a lot of economies, they want to industrialize. There's a lot of things people want to do with energy. So we shouldn't just look at, one side of the world and forget another side. There's nowhere in our climate promises where you can go ahead and hit net zero and leave 1 billion people in energy poverty. It just doesn't happen that way. So as we're talking about the just, as we're talking about equity, as we're talking about just the right thing to do, we also have to talk about the reality that this will mean more energy for a certain region in the world, and it means that the developed world has to use less. Energy efficiency is the best fuel source to try and, mitigate. You have to use less to make sure other people have more and they can come up again. So in our work at Sustainable Energy 4, really focus on that. And we have different partners, and some are here today, Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet, to say what is the best way of making sure people are truly not left behind. And it's not about, no offense to people in the solar home system space, but it's not about giving a solar lantern and ticking a box that you've electrified somebody. It's giving enough energy for people to live dignified lives.
Yep.
I think sometimes when we are in these forums or we are in countries like this, we sometimes forget that the people that we're really trying to help, at least in my role, are people who it's the difference between life and death. So for example, a woman cutting down trees using fuel wood could die prematurely because of this. It does happen. About 1 million women, already die because they're using fuel wood every day instead of using other cleaner sources of energy. For me, it's quite upsetting because that's not seen as an emergency. And everything has to be seen as emergency. Apart from the deforestation it causes, it's actually affecting human life. Before we talk about all the insurgencies, all the refugees that are actually leaving because of climate, there are key emergencies happening now. And these are solvable problems, right? We always talk about technology breakthroughs, which are so important, but everything we need to provide power to the people who don't have it, electricity and clean cooking, exists today. What doesn't exist, which Mahmoud was talking about, is the financing to do it. And even the political will exists. In my continent, I never thought I would see presidents coming and saying, we want to do the energy transition. Tell us how to do it. So you were sitting down with them, we're planning with them, but honestly, we don't know how it's going to be financed, which isn't a good place to be. So that's why we're looking for different innovative ways of financing. And one is what we're also presenting at the Abu Dhabi Sustainability Week, which is the African Carbon Market Initiative. How do we massively scale up the use of high integrity carbon markets that people can buy from Africa as a way to fund the transition, of which energy access and provision of energy is at the heart of it. I mean, it's important to understand the energy needs and what the energy is used for. That is very fundamental. So just from my engineering background, it's really important to understand how energy systems work, what it means for baseload, what types of energy you need, and then to understand how people want to develop. There's no scenario where you can actually succeed without having energy development and climate together. And that's what we've been trying to do in saying that, when you're telling countries, because this is a whole shift of an economic change in countries, you have to go and say, what exactly is your energy transition pathway? So if you take my country, Nigeria made it very clear. We needed to uplift 100 million people out of poverty, and we needed to uplift our industrial base. And if you can do it clean, that's your problem, but figure it out. So we need to take in consideration what the country wants. What we do a lot of time is take these regional approaches to a very localized problem. There's a vast difference from the energy transition plan in Nigeria to our neighbors in Ghana, to Kenya, but you say, oh, Africa as a whole. Africa is full of different countries and different nuances. Even in my country, what happens in northern Nigeria is different from what happens in southern Nigeria. So you have to understand that. That's the just and the energy part of it. And you also understand this takes a long time. The Nigerian president at COP26 announced they will get to net zero at 2060, not 2050. Because when you looked at the transport sector, the industrial sector, the oil and gas sector, it just wasn't possible. So being realistic about what a country has to do is important. And lastly, I have to touch on the finance again, because for a country like Nigeria to get to net zero with perfect policies, perfect political stability between now and 2060 will cost in the regions of $1.9 trillion. So we need to really be realistic when we talk about the numbers of what you're asking countries that are easily spending 80% of their revenue on debt servicing, on interest-only debt servicing, how exactly they're going to do it. So I don't know the solutions, but I'm excited to find how we're going to crack this. But this financing issue is really at the heart of the entire energy transition. I mean, like I said, it's 800 million without access, but it's actually 1 billion people in energy poverty because you have electricity doesn't mean you have it constantly. And what those figures don't talk about is the 2.4 billion people that don't have access to clean cooking as well. So when we talk about energy, we have to talk about both. I mean, the greatest risk is leaving those people behind. It's continuing with growing demands of energy elsewhere and leaving those people behind. And that's why energy efficiency is just so important. And we've seen it around Europe when people got high energy bills, they started using less. And that's the thinking that, in developing countries, there's hardly any waste because people don't have enough to use in the first place. So we really need to come together and look at what is the social return on investment by giving power to these people, affects GDP, affects jobs. It creates whole industries if we do focus as well with our efforts for places that don't have it. It's also important because if those people get electricity the way the rest of the world has, using very dirty fuels, we're going to go back in about 2 decades again saying we want to transition again, and we don't have to do that. Thank you. I think I've mentioned it a few times. It's all about money right now. There has to be a concerted effort on funding the transition in developing countries, knowing that energy access is at the heart of that transition, and developing industry and jobs. People don't like to live where they are, leave where they are because they just want to. They leave because they don't feel that they can get, what they need from their locality. And we see that, the climate issue has caused lots of conflicts, have caused lakes drying up. There's a lot of things happening, on continent and developing countries that can be avoided if there was just this effort. And this effort isn't just going to come from the private sector. It's hard for the private sector sometimes to even fund emerging economies, not to talk about developing countries. So sometimes the public-private partnerships and understanding that you do have to fund government, and developed countries that have caused a lot of these problems do have to put money on the table, because there is a social return on investment which will keep people hopefully in their localities and bring the economic growth that we want for everybody.